All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and supported entirely by listeners like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, so if you're hungry for more worker and labor-focused podcasts and radio shows like ours, follow the link in the show notes and go check out the great shows in our network. And if you want to support the work that we're doing here at Working People so that we can keep growing and keep bringing you more important conversations, please leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Share these episodes on your social media and with your coworkers and friends and family members. And of course, the best thing that you can do to support the show is become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just $5 a month. Just go to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Hit the subscribe button and you'll immediately get access to all of the awesome bonus episodes that we've recorded and published for our amazing subscribers over the years. And we've got a lot of fun bonus episodes coming your way this month. As you all know, it is October, which means it's officially spooky season, the best season of the year, in my opinion. And I've got to say, out of all the different quirks and traditions of podcasting, my absolute favorite tradition has always been the Halloween-themed episodes. Longtime listeners will remember that a couple years ago, we had a great crossover episode with the Horror Vanguard podcast, and that's on the public feed if you want to go back and check that one out. And then last year, we had an all Alvarez siblings special episode where we did a working class analysis of the spooky Halloween classic, Ernest Scared Stupid. And, if you want to go check that one out, it's on the Patreon bonus feed from last October. Probably one of my favorite episodes that we've ever recorded, but I always love recording with my siblings. And we all grew up watching Ernest Scared Stupid, so that was a lot of fun. Anyway, the point is we are making up for not posting bonus episodes last month by posting double the amount this month. And we're recording some fun bonus episodes for y'all this week. We're going to celebrate Striketober the right way. So don't miss out on that and go subscribe on Patreon. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and we're going to jump right into today's episode, which is the final interview from our special collaboration between In These Times and the Real News Network. Or I guess I should say that it's the final interview in our first series of investigations. You should definitely keep an eye out on what we're doing at the Real News, because we're about to launch our second series of video reports from Wisconsin, which is going to focus on the lives and struggles of teachers in the state 10 years after Republican Governor Scott Walker declared war on public sector unions with the passing of Act 10. So, definitely stay tuned for that. I think it's a really important series, and we will, of course, be publishing some of the audio from that investigation here on the Working People feed, but you'll also get more video reports over at the Real News. Now, if you listen to our recent episodes with farmer and beekeeper Christy Lynn Allen and our panel episode before that, then you know that I went to rural Wisconsin this past summer with Cameron Granadino from the Real News and Hannah Faris from In These Times to report on crucial struggles happening in the state of Wisconsin that have been undercovered by mainstream media. Our first investigation has looked at the ways that big agriculture and the factory farming industry have essentially gobbled up the vast majority of the rural landscape in America and the farming economy. If you watched the documentary that we produced for The Real News, which we've linked to in the show notes for today, then, you have seen the human faces of this story. You've heard firsthand from farmers and community members who are fighting to defend their homes and life as they know it from the onslaught of industrial farming. And if you've listened to our interviews here on the podcast feed, then I hope we've made it clear that this is an issue that concerns all of us. And we all need to care about this. And we need to show support for communities like those in Polk, Burnett, and Crawford counties in Wisconsin before it's too late. And if there's one thing that gives me hope, it's the grit and determination and the refusal to get pushed around by folks like Lisa Doerr. If you guys listened to the panel episode we did a couple of weeks back, then you heard a little bit of Lisa's story. She and her husband own and operate a hay farm in Polk County that supplies food for small-scale livestock farmers in the area. Lisa is a total badass, and, like Christy Lynn Allen, like Forrest Yankee, she has been very much on the front lines of this struggle. And if we had more people like Lisa fighting the good fight, then I have a sneaky suspicion that we would win more often. This is her story.
Yeah, my name is Lisa Doerr. I live in the town of Laketown in Polk County in Wisconsin, far northwestern Wisconsin. And my husband and I do a commercial forage operation, producing alfalfa and grass hay for small protein producers here in Polk County. So we make feed for people who produce lamb, mutton, beef, and we actually sell to some horse people too. So we have a small business that we run here. And then 2 years ago, a friend of mine called me up and said, "Hey, Lisa, some guy just tried to get me to sell my land to him for a hog factory, and that piece of land is about 1.3 miles east of here." So it wasn't hearsay, it wasn't maybe, it was, really happening. And then at the same time, up in Trade Lake Township, which is just adjacent to us here, maybe 6 miles away, there is a farmer who has sold out to a company. It's actually an Iowa company, but they manage hog factories in Iowa and Minnesota. So he has sold out to those guys, and he is trying to get permitted by the county and the state. It's actually was being driven by Burnett Dairy Co-op, which is a group of dairy farmers that are looking for some more value-added economic activity. So they want to create more demand for their corn and their soybeans. So they hatched this plan to try to get the hog factory industry to move into our area. And I don't really call them CAFOs, I call them hog factories, because CAFO is such a kind of obscure word. But they're giant industrial complexes full of tens of thousands of animals, and they never leave the building. They never get to go outside.
It's like Upton Sinclair's worst nightmare.
Well, Upton was really talking about the processors and when they butcher the meat. This is before the meat gets sent to the butcher plant. So it's vertically integrating the industry so that they not only own the processing plants, but they own the pigs, the sows that are farrowing the young weaners, they call them, and they own everything. They own the feed. They tell the quote unquote farmers exactly what genetics to have. Everything is controlled by the company from top to bottom. So after we heard about that, we organized at the town level, the town of Laketown. And so in June of 19, we turned out over 200 people on a very beautiful, warm summer night to come to the town board meeting and say, what's going on? We need a moratorium. And so that moratorium was passed in July of 19 for our town. And then there's about 5 towns around us that have done similar things. Then for the last year, took about a year and a half because of COVID, but we produced a study that documents what the potential impact could be in our town of the CAFO. But the committee was made up of pro CAFO and con CAFO people. And so we actually have about 39 or 40 citations from industry about why it's good too. So it's a balanced study. Then at the same time, we spent about 2 years working at the county level, trying to get our county to pass something. And actually, I ended up running for county commissioner. We fielded about 5 different candidates to run for county commissioner, and I lost by 15 votes. So if I could have got 8 people to vote for me instead of the other guy, then I would have had to be a county commissioner. But I did not win that. But we turned out hundreds of people. For 3 months straight, we staged rallies at the county trying to get them to pass an ordinance. And they ended up passing an ordinance that targets Jonestown and Georgetown, those townships, which is where the Ojibwe tribes are. So that's where they want the CAFOs to be built. But the ordinance that they passed doesn't even cover our town at all. Our town is kind of independent. We don't have any zoning authority in our town. So only towns that have zoning authority are covered by this ordinance that the county passed. So it's kind of funny. So what we've done now is we ended up during the town election, which was April of 21, we ran candidates who ran as being against hog factories, and we won 57 to 43%. So that just happened in April. And so now we are trying to pull together a group of 5, maybe 6 towns, and then we would all pass a really strong ordinance. And that's no small feat because Wisconsin has passed a whole series of laws that make it very difficult to have local control. So we have to kind of thread the needle on that.
Yeah, and I want to kind of spend some time talking about that, right? Talking about that issue of local control and kind of how this fight in particular, right, has both galvanized the community, right, and brought people from different kind of political leanings, people of different lifestyles, what have you, together around this issue of not wanting this industrial hog factory, like you said, being put here. And what that struggle has kind of showed y'all about, what authority, if any, townships and counties like yours, have, to stop something like this. So I want to talk about that, but I guess before we get there, again, to really drill down on this for people who are watching, if we could talk first about, what we know about a hog factory of this size, what goes on there and what it would mean for this community and for you and your husband and the farm that you have here.
Well, we're talking about a very large facility filled with sows. It's called a farrowing facility. So the sows would produce about 200,000 babies every year. And those weaners spend about 3 weeks in that farrowing factory. And then they're sent to what are called finishing plants. And the finishing plants feed them until they're about 250 pounds before they're shipped to the slaughterhouses. And they can't really get more than 280 pounds at the most because then the machinery for slaughtering them doesn't work. So that's why when COVID hit, they had to euthanize I believe the number ended up being almost 1 million pigs because the slaughterhouses had to shut down and the pigs got too big. But actually, some of the guys around here went down to southern Minnesota and got trailers full of these pigs and brought them up here. And they were really funny because they'd never been outside before. They'd always been in these little cages inside. And so they kind of like stood on the trailer and they're like, well, now what do we do? And they finally got them out of the trailer and then they're like, what's this? It's dirt. Because usually they're in a cement floor factory. And so it took them like 2 or 3 days to get used to being outside. So that the thing is they don't want to build one farrowing plant because they don't want to have to ship a bunch of wieners in trailers like down to Iowa to get finished off. So what they'd really like to do is have a farrowing plant with maybe 5 finishing plants around it. And that's what you see in Iowa. Like in Iowa, there's like a finishing plant every 2,000 feet. You know, everybody and their brother has a finishing plant. And they make maybe, from what I've heard, these guys make maybe $20,000, $30,000 a year feeding these pigs out and getting them ready to go to slaughter. The impact of it, we're talking about 9 million pounds of manure that would be spread all over the county, basically. I mean, everywhere that he could get people to let it be spread. And people mostly think about the manure, but the air emissions are what really have a negative impact on the communities because we're talking about massive amounts of hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and methane. And, you know, people always say, oh, pigs stink. Well, it isn't stink. It's chemicals. It's hydrogen sulfide. So it's a very different level of menace than a lot of the dairy operations. So what we've seen, we have a lot of data that's starting to come in. Immediate drop of like 25%, 30% property values if you're anywhere near the plant. You know, up to 80% if you're within a quarter mile or half mile of these factories, that your property values just plummet. And if you want to know the truth, that's the most potent organizing tool, is because these people have spent their decades working their tails off to try to build a home and make a farm or a lake home or whatever it is. And then some guy comes in and says, I'm going to build a hog factory and it's going to be great. And they're like, no, it's not. We don't want you here. So that, and the other organizing tool that is, it really crosses party lines, because you've got people who are really interested in the environment. You've got people really interested in property values, and you've got a contingent of people who are very concerned about China. And the fact that really we've been told point blank that this pork will go to the Smithfield plant. And Smithfield is owned by the, Chinese Communist Party. That they put up a $4.1 billion loan in one day to buy Smithfield. They are basically telling us that we need to destroy our property value so that Smithfield can produce pork for China. That's been an interesting organizing thing too, is that this whole thing about the global economy and how this, supposed enemy of the American people is, all this ridiculous politicians saying stuff about China. And then at the same time, they want us to turn our livelihoods over to them. So those are some of the issues that we've organized on: the environmental impact, property values, destroying our quality of life to send food to the Communist Party of China so they can enslave the Uyghur people. So it's quite a constellation of issues.
I would say, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, like it's fascinating in and of itself, just like how something that on the surface, I think a lot of people who don't live in rural areas would think, oh, this kind of goes on all the time, right? Like, do we put this kind of hog farm here? Do we put it here? But you scratch a little underneath the surface and you start to learn about all the kind of different outside and interceding kind of forces that are involved here, and all the ways that is kind of bringing a diverse group of people in the community kind of together against this one thing and working together across their differences to figure out how to kind of like achieve your goals, right? Because I think that one of the things that you and I have been talking about throughout the day, right, is that, you know, these types of facilities, you know, they're pitched as, you know, an economic boon to areas like these, right? When really what it would mean is like kind of the death of economic life for everybody here. You yourself are, as we said, you're supplying kind of hay to local protein producers in a market that has quite a few independent kind of protein producers, which is like really special and unique. And people also get to own those farms and
Exactly.
you know, build that product, you know, themselves. And so what sort of economic boon is Smithfield saying it's going to bring to this county when everyone around is looking and saying, well, it's going to hurt me, it's going to hurt you. Who actually is it going to help?
Well, as far as we can tell, the only person that it helps is the guy who's selling the 38 acres is going to get some amount of change for his 38 acres, probably with some sort of premium price that we'll never know. That is not public. We don't know. But the buildings themselves are brought in kind of like a Dollar General. You know how they just bring in a Dollar General on a bunch of semi trucks and put it up. The big hog barns are just brought in. All the outfitting in the inside, all the metal and cages and everything are brought in. The workers are brought in. And one of the most irritating things that these guys say in the dairy industry, chickens, hogs, they say, well, we can't find anybody to do the work. Well, who the heck wants to go to work and make an investor group a bunch of money shoveling manure and hauling out carcasses and throwing them in a compost pile? I mean, it's crummy jobs, and people don't want them, and so they end up bringing in, as you'd say, what we've seen is 75% of the workers are immigrant labor, and that is people who are sending the money home, which is cool. I understand why they'd send their money home. That's where their people are, but they're not putting it into our economy. And the whole system is driven by immigrant labor. And it's one of the most difficult parts of the whole thing to even talk about, because obviously we're the descendants of immigrants, right? But our people were allowed to, after we destroyed the native habitat, we were allowed to farm. We were allowed to participate in the Homestead Act and get our land. Well, these immigrant people are not allowed to do anything like that. They really don't even get to go to the bar. I mean, we never even see them. I mean, I know people who are living within a couple miles here in their trailer houses, and I don't know them because they don't talk to anybody because they don't want to get deported. So that issue is really interesting in terms of the global economic system.
Right. And I just to I guess like hammer that point home, right? I mean, I think it was just this week, workers at a Smithfield plant, I think in South Dakota, authorized a strike vote at the very plant where, you know, Smithfield became, was in the headlines over the past year because of the working conditions in COVID, right? You take that plus all the hullabaloo that we had in the media about there being a pork shortage during COVID. And so you had massive speed ups. You already had people working in dangerous, and vile kind of conditions in these sorts of hog facilities. Add on to that a deadly pandemic. And you essentially have kind of an underclass of slave labor that's living in these trailers around these facilities, working from morning till night and not really, you know, making enough or even being given the freedom to participate in the community life. Like that's kind of what you're describing, right?
Yeah. And that's what drives the whole industry. It's a whole industry it's basically a plantation economic model. It's big capital, cheap labor, as opposed to the vision under the Homestead Act. The idea of it was, you put the big labor in and small capital. So it's a very different model. And one of my dairy friends, I have a dairy friend who lives about a mile from here, and he explained it to me 20 years ago. How can he possibly compete with a dairy that's got 2,000 cows and they're paying $7 an hour? And, he's trying to run a family dairy. I mean, so when they say no one wants to work, 800, 1,000 dairy farms a year are going out of business, and they're crying the whole time. They want to work. They just don't want to work for an investor group. And that really irritates me when they say people don't want to work.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's so transparent too, because we saw this like before half of the adult American population here in the United States was even vaccinated. You saw this kind of chorus of ghouls from industry groups, from think tanks, politicians who are being bankrolled by these same lobbying groups. This whole ghoulish chorus rose up saying no one wants to work after the pandemic because everyone was getting fat off, the dole, the government, unemployment benefits. And really what it was a transparent and obvious attempt to discipline the working class back into subservience, right? To say, okay, you lazy pieces of shit, go back to working in unsafe conditions for low wages. And in fact, we're going to force you to do that with a number of states cutting off those unemployment benefits. Again, before even half the population, the adult population, was vaccinated. It's a form of discipline. Right, it's a form of pushing people back into that meat grinder that you're talking about, and it infuriates me. And as we're describing, we're seeing it, we're living it, it's all around this country, right? And it's in this county, and it's part of the CAFO fight. And I guess I wanted to kind of bring us back to that, right? Because you yourself, along with other members of the community, have been involved in this fight. And I guess I wanted to ask, for folks watching who are kind of just learning the nuances of this, what this kind of struggle has shown you, what you came to realize when, people banded together and said, okay, we don't want this thing here. What can we do about it? And it's almost like that's when the real kind of shenanigans began. Could you talk to us a bit about that struggle?
Sure. Yeah. I try to base my work on personal relationships, like talking to people person to person. It's very tempting to get into the rhetoric and try to go off. And sometimes I do that, but I try not to. So we've built, relationships across party lines and across age groups, and have a lot of young people, but what we found was particularly at the county level, when we started making some progress, then the big boys came in, the Farm Bureau and the different dairy groups. They brought in the big guns. They started writing letters to the supervisors saying that if they passed a moratorium, it would be a felony and they'd have to go to jail. And we, in our little town of Laketown here, tiny little town, we had a moratorium study group, and the Madison boys actually sent someone to come to the meeting on a summer night. I'm like, what are you doing here? And she said, oh, I just thought I'd visit. Her name is Kim Bremer. I'm like, what are you doing here? And she's, oh, I'm just here to see. I'm just a little suburban housewife. I thought I'd come to the meeting. And so they're deadly serious. Yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. And each one of these dairy CAFOs or hog CAFOs, they have a huge debt burden that they're carrying. So there's a lot of financing going on, a lot of financing to buy the equipment. You always got to be getting the latest update. You got to buy your robots. There's a huge amount of capital. So the capital, you'll see the capital boys come in too. So we basically got our butts kicked at the county. They passed a really, really bad ordinance and showed us the door. So what we're doing now is trying to work at the local level. And it meant trying to get people elected, thinking long term. And then we have some really good lawyers who think that they've figured out how to thread that needle and pass some ordinances that can finesse the existing state laws. And what we found, we've seen in other places, we don't have any big hog CAFOs in northern Wisconsin. And if you can make it somewhat challenging, maybe they'll just go away. So the guy who's trying to build the hog CAFO in Burnett County, he was trying to build it up on Lake Superior and in Bayfield County. And Bayfield County passed a good ordinance, and he scurried out of there and came down here. So that's what we're trying to do here, is pass something to stop them before they come. Unfortunately, you cannot ban factory farms under Wisconsin law, but we think we can build an ordinance that will require them to do the due diligence that is needed to protect our communities, and we think that'll stop them.
And even just like what you're describing there is like something that I think people watching would probably assume that if you're going to build a 26,000 hog factory, that you would have to do like an environmental impact report, right? You would have to kind of go to the town and say, here's what this is going to mean for your environment and your community. They don't have to do that, right? I mean, like in a way, the ordinances that we're talking about, I guess just to kind of flesh it out for viewers, is like you're trying to at least force the company to thoroughly prove, like what sorts of environmental impacts this facility would have on this community. And I think I'm still kind of blown away that they're not legally required to do that in the first place.
No, the agricultural community has successfully exempted themselves from almost all environmental regulation, and particularly the Clean Water Act is, in some states, they don't even need a permit to pollute. In Wisconsin, they have to get a permit to pollute. And the whole thing is based on their manure management plan, which they call a nutrient management plan, which is flawed from the beginning. The management plans were designed to maximize corn and soybean production. So they're really designed to maximize the amount of nitrogen that's going on a field so you can get some nice green corn. They're not designed to protect water quality. So they're at a methodology level, they are so deeply flawed. It's kind of pitiful. And then when it comes to air pollution, there is literally no regulation of air pollution at all. Since 2005, they've exempted themselves from all regulation of their air emissions. So if you're running a plant and making car parts, you have to get a permit to pollute the air. But if you're dumping hydrogen sulfide and ammonia on your neighbors, you don't have to get one if you're a farmer. So, yeah, I hate to tell people, but there really is a Santa Claus, but there really isn't any regulation of these giant hog factories. And they'll tell you differently. They'll say, "Oh, we're so heavily regulated, we can hardly breathe in the morning." And then when you actually look at it, it's totally the opposite.
Well, and one thing that we really want to highlight with kind of all the videos that we're producing for this partnership between The Real News and In These Times, focused on issues in rural Wisconsin, right, is we want people to understand the severity of struggles like these, right? And it's not just a struggle for one community. It's not just a struggle about one CAFO, right? Even this one CAFO that we're talking about could pollute the St. Croix River down the road. That St. Croix River pollution could then pollute the Mississippi River. Like, this stuff spreads, right? Not to mention, as you said, all the other kind of environmental and economic devastation that does filter out beyond the kind of county borders, right? And so this is an issue that people should care about. On the surface, we should care about it because it's horrific. Beyond that, we should also care about it because it also impacts us. It impacts all of us. And so I wanted to ask, if we could also, on top of looking at the kind of the hard truths of the stories that we're covering, we also want to kind of highlight how people are working together to fight against them, right? How people are banding together, like yourself, like other members of this community. And even after you run up against all the red tape, all the ways that the state and corporations have essentially stripped communities' abilities to fight against things like these. How, against all those odds, you're still working to find creative ways to resist and stand up for your community, stand up for your land, stand up for the environment. So could we talk a little more about those ordinances that you were mentioning? And I guess give viewers a bit more of a granular sense of how the fight is being carried on through this push for different types of ordinances.
Well, basically, the capital of Wisconsin is Madison. And what I tell people is the big ag boys got to Madison way ahead of us. They got to Washington, D.C. even sooner. I mean, they've laid this legal basis for about, I would say, 20 to 30 years. And also the ideology that, we're feeding the world. I don't know how many times you've heard we're feeding the world. The world doesn't want us to feed them. They want to produce their own food. I mean, how much more vulnerable can you be than to be relying on the United States of America for your food? And we're really not feeding the world. We're really just feeding China. I mean, if you actually look at the data, some of the food goes to Mexico, some of it goes to Canada, but mostly what American agriculture produces, 70% of the beans go to China, and China's the big player. So anyway, what we've had to do at the local level is put together an ordinance that does it. It basically says, okay, we're not banning factory farms, but you have to prove to us that you are not going to pollute the water, that you're going to monitor the water in your area so you can prove you're not going to pollute the water, that you're going to show us that you are not going to pollute the air, that you're going to show us that you are not going to spread carcasses all over. So it basically requires them to show you the money, basically. Whereas at the state level, they just give people a permit to pollute. I mean, literally, that's what the Clean Water Act does. It gives them a permit to pollute. So we're telling them you have to prove that you're not going to pollute. And then the final thing that we're going to do is require them to have financial proof that if something goes wrong, that they can pay for it, not the taxpayers. And, so basically they need a multi-million-dollar financial bond that's going to bond them to say that if they end up burning, for example, many of these barns burn down. So if they burn the barn down, do they have enough money to get all the dead 10,000 pigs out of there and put them in a landfill? Or are they just going to walk on that? The front end, we're saying you got to pay the real costs of these applications. And on the back end, you have to prove that you can mop up after yourself. And those two things they're really pushing back on that. They do not want to have the financial surety bonds that are needed to guarantee that they won't leave us with a mess. So those are some of the details.
I mean, I really appreciate you kind of laying this out. Right? A big focus of this whole project, the Wisconsin idea that in these times began and that the Real News is now collaborating with them for, right, is to, highlight, right, the struggles of people living in rural America, right, to get people in other parts of the country to take an interest and to become as invested in these sorts of struggles as we are in others. And so I wanted to ask if you had kind of a message for people outside of Polk and Burnett County, people who are watching this, something that speaks to kind of like why people should take interest in this story and how they can show support, not only for y'all here, but I guess for, if it's happening here, it's happening in other parts of rural America, as we know. So I guess I wanted to just ask if you had kind of a final message for people watching.
Yeah, I guess the way I look at it is it's a struggle that is going on in many places. It's an economic system that's really designed to reward investors, not labor. And the the Democrats passed NAFTA in the 70s, or I guess it was the 90s, forgive me, passed NAFTA in the 90s, has destroyed the working class manufacturing sector. And now they're looking at destroying the middle class rural economy. We're the next target. And in terms of what people can do, I mean, honestly, being aware of where your food comes from. I mean, when you go to the store and buy some pork, it shouldn't be from Smithfield. But that's a big lift to ask people. What I think is becoming politically active and supporting candidates that actually understand rural issues. And there's a fair amount of room for improvement on that. Let's putting that politely. That when you're looking at the list of issues, what is more important than the food that we produce, right? I mean, right now we're looking at the Imperial Valley in California running out of water. The fruit basket, the nut basket, and the vegetable basket of the North American continent is running out of water. So that the issue really to bring to the fore politically is how are we producing our food and who's benefiting. When you hear President Biden talk about, we gotta improve the agricultural exports, think about pigs being sent to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, chopped into 4, put in a box, and being shipped to China. And then me having to suck in the bad air to make it happen.